A few weeks ago, I was following a particular train of thought down through the rabbit warrens of the internet. And as I scrolled the comments section below a blog on theology that I had just finished, I came across a question in bold that caught my eye. It asked, "What should I tell my mom to reassure her that UU isn't a cult?" The writer of the question added, "I told her about it and how its beliefs are rooted in love and compassion, and she, the writer's mom, said, 'I'm wary of religions that aren't commonly known. Those religions are the ones that ensnare you and force you to do terrible things.' I think she worries that UU is a cult. How can I convince her otherwise?" Well, I was already feeling like I'd traveled way too far down this time drain, but I couldn't keep myself from looking through the responses. Some folks tried to be helpful. One said, "The only time I was called a cultist, it turned out the person confused us with the Unification Church," adding, "Tell your mom that Dear Abby sometimes mentions UU churches as an understanding and accepting place. Maybe Dear Abby would be a credible source for her." Another person tried the historic approach, offering up that, contrary to common belief, Unitarian Universalism has been around a long time and that many of the founding fathers and mothers were Unitarian. Okay, so far. The next person wrote, "Jingle bells. I keep hearing about how some UU wrote Jingle Bells. Your mom has probably grown up with that song. That should make her feel comfortable." Responding to the mother's concern about her child being ensnared, someone wrote, "It's easy enough to leave a UU church, though. At worst, the UUs will keep you on their email listserv until you ask to be removed. Cults, not so much." Finally, with tongue-in-cheek, one writer chirped, "Tell her about our coffee rituals and our comprehensive sexuality education. That should help." I'll stop at this point and tell you that the original plan for this service was to continue on a lighter note, poking a bit of fun at Unitarian Universalism, all with the hope of wrapping it up with a challenge to all of us to really think about what this tradition is and what it means to us and what it can be. And while the scope of the service really hasn't changed that much, as often happens on the way to the pulpit, other things grab your attention, events challenge your thinking, people ask difficult questions, history indeed enters into the equation, and all of a sudden there are a lot of serious things to talk about. We live in anxious times in which just about every aspect of our world is under significant stress. Our politicians can't see beyond their own concerns to even think about leading us through and out of the great divides that rend our nation. The environmental issues we face are catastrophic. Our economic system, at least in light of the great disparity of wealth and income, is broken. And all these issues only serve to heighten the racial tensions that are already present, so deeply seated in America's people, including within you and me. How do we answer the call to go back out into the world each day and live good and meaningful lives? How do we open our hearts to be truly welcoming to anyone who looks at the values we espouse and is drawn to join us? Where do we look to find the grounding, the spiritual grounding we need to be resilient in the face of all this turmoil and challenge? What is the foundation of our faith that can keep us from a sense of despair? In times such as these, when liberalism is under attack and on the defensive, I truly think how we as Unitarian Universalists and how liberal religion in general answers that call. I think it's critical to look and see how we do that. Within its relatively short history, Unitarian Universalism has been attacked in many ways far more seriously than being called a cult by those who really don't know anything about us. On the other hand, you could easily couch some of the more serious critiques of our tradition in the language of cultism. Indirectly, in fact, we've been charged with being the cult of the wishy-washy individualism. One Christian website I looked at had a pretty accurate description of Unitarian Universalist beliefs and principles, and then summarized it all up by saying, in their attempt to be free-thinking and non-creedal, the UUs have become so liberal that little religious substance remains. They deny almost every doctrine of the Christian faith, replacing the worship of God with a worship of self. Billy Graham, in fact, had listed Unitarian Universalism as one of the many cults of which people needed to be careful. And when talk show host Stephen Colbert found out about this, he took his own poke at us, saying, "Oh, yes, the dangerous cult of Unitarian Universalism, a group whose sacred texts are the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the book Free to Be You and Me." Or how about the cult of intellectualism? Many mainline Protestant churches, including and sometimes especially Unitarian Universalist churches, have been tagged with the term the frozen chosen, a reference to our highly rational, non-emotional approach to religion. This challenge goes back as far back as Ralph Waldo Emerson, who, though a Unitarian, charged Unitarian ministers of his day with being corpse cold in their preaching. We don't feel the stress of the world's problems with our intellect. We feel it with our entire being. We hold it in our bodies. And if we don't engage the realities of our situation with our entire being, we are not helping ourselves or others to move forward. Our problem-solving brains can easily lead us to skepticism unless our hearts balance the narrative. Finally, we've been accused of being a cult of exceptionalism, where we think our more reasoned approach clearly superior to any other belief system or practices, and while we give lip service to the idea that our peculiar way of practicing religion should be attractive to many, many more people, it seems that as a whole we are actually quite content to sit smugly on the religious margins, talking a good game, but somewhat resistant to real change that might make us more relevant in a growing diverse world. Our 7 principles are a fine set of aspirational ethical guidelines, but in and of themselves they don't constitute a religion. And while truly living into them is a challenge, I believe a true challenge, they are not a set of words that you're going to look at for comfort when the world pushes at the door, nor the kind of poetry that anyone would get emotionally charged up about, other than perhaps those who helped draft them. So how do we respond to the critics who say that liberal religion, and especially Unitarian Universalism, doesn't have the depth to answer today's challenges? Where do we find the grounding we need to answer the call? What is the foundation of our faith that can keep us from despair and moving forward with hope? In part, we look within these walls and the stories of strength and compassion that holds this community together. Personal stories of how this faith and the people here have been the saving grace that someone has needed to pull through a crisis. How the delivery of a warm meal and the companionship of a fellow congregant has made the difference in a rough passage. How something shared in a chalice circle has opened the eyes of one listener and helped them see their own experiences in a new light. How the service a friend offers through one of our social justice initiatives has inspired them to volunteer themselves. I hear these personal stories all the time, and they often speak to the importance of sacred community and ever-deepening connections that are clearly a hallmark of this congregation and a critical ingredient of resilience in stressful times. But the times are more demanding than ever, and if we are to answer the call not only to nurture our own, but also co-create places of welcome and acceptance with others, and to help provide solace and healing to a wider world, We have to translate this idea of caring community into a more universal story that will carry us through and beyond our times of doubt and hardship. In the first reading that Lena shared with you this morning, Paul Razor was pretty clear about the challenges of the liberal religious journey. And in the second reading, Leslie Takahashi invited us to explore the depths of our own labyrinth and seek our own center. But while we long held up freedom of conscience and the individual search for truth and meaning as important aspects of our tradition, I would argue that the communal aspect of the journey is even more crucial. Yes, we are free to follow our transcendentalist forebears out into nature and discover its sacred depths. Or yes, we can find deep and meaningful connections of the Spirit in a gathering of those with whom we share experiences. We can thrive with the sound of a particular piece of music, or see a piece of art, or hear a poem. But if we don't bring those deep experiences and insights back into the relationships and the conversations we hold here, where they can be shared and viewed and investigated and celebrated, we've missed the point, we've missed the strength, and we've missed the value of religious community. And if we limit our sharing to a more reasoned view of the world, or to the times when we have felt a deep connection of the world, and we don't share our struggles and our fears and our pain and our doubts as well, and our hopes, we aren't really sharing the whole journey. When we aspire to share a shared journey where our lives are enriched by the many perspectives and experiences of our fellow travelers, we begin to create together the ground of our collective being. As one of my favorite UU writers, Lisa Friedman, puts it, being an individual for the sake of individualism isn't enough to save the world. Being an individual for the sake of our collective freedom and dignity is everything. Being an individual for the sake of individualism isn't enough to save the world. Being an individual for the sake of our collective freedom and dignity is everything. We build meaning together. We grow resiliency together. At our best, we who also understand that along with human freedom, to whatever extent we enjoy it, comes a responsibility to our shared humanity and to the planet upon which we are dependent, which brings us up against a hard truth and our own stated aspiration to build a wider community of peace, justice, and love. The hard truth is the fact that Unitarian Universalism, both locally and nationally, struggles with diversity, which is to say we struggle with racism. Last week, Jim Kenney reminded us what we already know, or should know, that what we call race is only skin deep. But racism, my friends, goes much deeper and insinuates itself into bone and sinew in ways that we are not always aware. Those of us whose skin is light can exist comfortably and quietly as part of a culture that has worked hard to maintain the status quo of patriarchy and white supremacy for a long, long time. And despite what we consider the fundamental truth of our interdependence, moving beyond our own comfort zones, moving beyond our own experiences centered in whiteness and into solidarity with people whose skin isn't the same can be extremely difficult, especially in a world where centuries of oppression have become hardwired into our very being. Thus, we are called, I believe, as liberal religious community to find ways to show up to the collective struggle, even and especially if that work is difficult. We are called to listen and to feel the joy and the sorrow unspeakable that Barbara A. Holmes writes about. Ours must be a shared human journey in all its variety and depth. And I invite us all to deepen into understanding of what that might mean to us and what it might look like. How do we do this work? How do we reach out and touch? And how do we reach out and look into people's eyes and find community and hope and wisdom and trust? What does Unitarian Universalism look like to you? What should it look like to all of us? How do we move from here to there? Let me close with the words of the Reverend Lisa Friedman. Together we ground ourselves in the work and the vision of this place. Together we bear witness to the beauty and power of our human collective. Together we strive and struggle for a future that redeems the sorrows of today. Together we defend human freedom, that one day we might all be free. Together we are more than we can ever be alone. So may it be.